Yarn to post-war Munich last week with John Pascoe, the opera director. But we've had a thread running through the series which has been a good hard examination of our own surroundings here in Charleston and the Low Country. And we're coming home to that again today, which I'm really delighted about. I thought I'd share with you a little insight I had this morning. I dug out off my bookshelf a book which was printed in 1885 in London called Model Housekeeping and Cooking. And someone gave it to me as a joke when I went to university, thinking there was no chance I'd ever be interested in anything like that. Little did they know that I would be sitting at breakfast going through it avidly this morning. One of the sort of themes that's run through our talks has been rice. Julie Flavel talked about the slave Robert Lawrence, and Jonathan Green talked about Gullah culture and the particular importance of rice. And I imagine that rice will feature in the Lee brothers' talk, or at least in their books. And I was interested to see, people always talk about the British having no clue about rice in those days, at the end of the 19th century. And it's true. I mean, if you look at the book, most of the recipes involve nutmeg, sugar, cinnamon, and boiling for about 2 hours. And so they're all puddings. But then I thought, hang on, we were quite involved in India at that time. So what were we doing with our curries? And I turned to the section, Indian curries, and it said, for Patna rice, which was the recipe, make sure you use Patna rice, not Carolina rice. And this was the only recipe in the whole book that specified what sort of rice you need to use, which means that the assumption for all the other recipes was that you'd be using Carolina rice. And that's a full 20 years after the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the collapse of the rice economy. So I thought that was rather interesting. Anyway, that's a little aside. If any of you share my sort of passion for these little details on the passion that you're here to hear about from the Lee brothers, then you will be interested and delighted to hear that we have a new bookshop in town called Heirloom Books, just up the road at 124 King Street? 123. And they are stocking all kinds of magazines and books that many of which you'll never have heard of, and you'll be really excited to see, as well as herbs and other products. And they are sponsoring our lunch today, so we're very, very grateful to Heirloom Books for their support, and we hope that we'll be working with them often in the future. We're excited to have them as neighbours. On to the Lee brothers. They don't need much introduction to all of you, but I've just had pause for thought when I found a number of people who were asking me, so are they going to talk about food or business? And I said, oh, that's interesting, because actually Matt and Ted are not only highly successful and award-winning cookbook writers, they're model entrepreneurs, and we could all learn a lot from them on that side of things. But today we think they're sticking to the cooking. Maybe we'll get them back another time to talk about the business side of things. They have an incredibly busy schedule, and we are really lucky to have caught them on a Charleston flyby, because most of their dates are taken up months in advance. And so we're extremely grateful to have them here, very excited to hear what they have to say. And two Le Creuset dishes. And so I need to...
We weren't allowed to enter this raffle. Sorry to say. Where's the bin?
We have the pop. It's for a Le Creuset pop. I love Le Creuset. And they didn't endorse me to say that. It's really special cookware. So whoever we choose is going to be really happy. And then the rest
And there's
of you
bribes in here as well. I see a $50 bill. I'll do my best not to grab
There'll
it.
be a number, so you need to have your ticket and your raffle ticket.
And the winner is 10168.
10168.
In the case of a default, the speakers get it. Okay, Ted, why not?
10039. Sounds like
Upper Manhattan.
zip code for Hell's Kitchen.
No? Yes?
You were choosing from the wrong stack.
for supplying these. Please go and buy all your cookware there.
Although they're soon to move to Renly's Point, to a castle on the river, where the owner can park his or her boat. That's why they're moving there. That's what I've heard.
Okay, the winner of the raffle is 10222.
Maureen Cohen. I promise it wasn't fixed. We're so grateful to Maureen. She's shared so much of her knowledge about Charleston cookery with us. in just the last couple of months. 10306. In the front row. Congratulations.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you to Ann Cleveland and the Library Society for bringing us here. We're delighted. We've been in Charleston almost full time since December, working on a new book. And we're actually headed to Myrtle Beach. We're spending the weekend in Myrtle Beach. We're opening for Paula Deen. Tomorrow, yeah, y'all know who Paula Deen, right? Is right. Yep. We're ready to give her
Alpha to Omega.
Yeah. So the title of our presentation is Southern Food, Past and Present, or the State of Southern Food, or Yankees are going crazy for grits. It's okay. It's okay. That's the title of our presentation. Our thesis is rather simple. Matt and I truly believe there's never been a better time than now to be studying, learning about Southern food, to be eating Southern food, and to be cooking Southern food. And we're fortunate in our strange and circuitous route to talking to you today. We pervade Southern pantry staples to expatriate Southerners, and
That's a euphemism for boiled peanuts. Pantry staples.
But we've basically been writing about Southern food for 20 years and pretty much interpreting Southern food to people who don't necessarily know anything about it. What Matt's saying is, can you speak into the microphone, please, which is always his complaint.
My pet peeve is being in the back of the audience and not being able to hear what. If you have something to say it. Make it heard.
I'm Ted Lee.
Let the lion out.
I tend to start things off because I need to have my voice heard.
He likes to have his printed notes here. He likes to call it a presentation. I prefer for it to be more like a discussion and like a nitpicking fest and like a collaboration and a conversation. And there will be elements of both.
We're very different.
Not some others brothers.
Amazing we've made it this far.
Not Dean brothers either.
So there's so many familiar faces out in the crowd that I feel like it's almost crazy to introduce ourselves. But there are certain particulars in our background that you may not know, and in these last 15 years, we feel like so much has happened in the world of Southern food, and our weird route from purveying boiled peanuts to writing Southern cookbooks sort of dramatizes a lot of what's changed. And so we thought we'd start at the beginning and tell a little bit about ourselves, and then move on to what we feel is super exciting about now in Southern food. We grew up at 83 East Bay Street on Rainbow Road, tall yellow row house, 1789 row house. But we moved here when I was 7 and Matt was 9 from New York City. So,
1979.
Yeah, in 1979. So thank you all for not getting up and leaving. That happens sometimes. Our parents are New Yorkers. There's just no way to get around it. So we grew up in Charleston with no Southern grandmother, which is a curse. It really was strange, but if there was a good side to that, it was that we moved here as kids. We were immediately immersed in a culture that's so sort of drenched in food without really knowing it, because all our friends who we met, virtually immediately upon landing in Charleston, they all knew how to catch crabs, they all knew how to throw a cast net at age 7 and shuck oysters and do all those things. basically we learned the food life of the Low Country from other people, because our parents certainly were no help in that. I don't think.
Feel free to name check a few people if you want to, because in this crowd, I mean, usually last week we gave a lecture to an audience of this size, well, 3 times the size in Richmond, Virginia, to the Tuckahoe Women's Club. And it was a friendly audience. They were Southern, and we could highlight some connections that Charleston had to Richmond. But this is unusual that we get to talk to people who actually know Charleston.
Where's Andrew Gear? Andrew, I saw you. There he is. So Andrew Gear's father, Charles Gear, he taught me how to gig for Flounder. Waking up at 3 in the morning. He never taught you. I'm sorry, man. You were listening to punk rock and hanging out in Marion Square. We know you. We were Charlie and I. We were good little kids. We wanted to learn stuff. So. But I do remember waking up in the house on Atlantic Street, having a sleepover, going out to Allendale at 3 o'clock in the morning with these like scary Tridents, in an old green Chevrolet truck.
And a flashlight.
And a flashlight, and going out in the creek and thinking, wow, this is really different. Like, this is not New York. And never mind the fact that we almost never came back with flounder, but we came back with a lot of destroyed blue crabs.
It's a hard way to put food on the table.
But so there was that. It was actually Mayor Riley and his family who introduced us to boiled peanuts, because shortly after we got here, they took us to a Charleston Royals game back when Royal Stadium was up on Rutledge, and a fly ball would usually hit a parked car and break a window. And we had our first boiled peanuts there. And food is so much a part of life in Low Country, and I don't need to lecture you all on that, but I think that when we grow up here, we tend to almost take it for granted. And you're thinking, why are there oyster knives in the glove compartment as a kid? And then suddenly, almost overnight, you're 23 years old, you're hosting your first oyster roast, and then you think, there's 60 people coming and I have 20 knives. I hope everyone's bringing, I hope everyone else has an oyster knife in the glove compartment. So we started out, I think we were predisposed to love Southern food because it was the first thing we could latch onto that was so exotic and so rewarding at the same time about moving here. And we got into the kitchen at an early age because our mom, whom some of you may know, Liza Lee, she, when Matt got his learner's permit, about the same time, she took a job where she was commuting to New York. And since our dad worked at the medical university, that sort of left open who was going to sort of help get food on the table, because he didn't come home from MUSC until 7 or so. And we were folded into the food life of the family, which is a great thing to happen at a young age, because we had shopping lists, and there were tasks, peeling shrimp, boiling rice, and we weren't really the cooks, I'd say, but we were like Dad's prep cooks. So he'd call us and say what he needed done, just so that he could come in later and sort of take care of the real stuff. But also shopping. Shopping is sort of an undersung part of cooking, and it's so important. And as a kid, like if you see a pound of shrimp on the shopping list, and the first time you go to the fish counter at the Harris Teeter or the Pig, and you say, okay, I need a pound of shrimp, and then they say, well, do you want medium or large? Do you want head on, shell on, peeled and deveined? You sort of have to get used to the vocabulary of shopping, and that's a really cool thing. So we ended up being interested viscerally in sort of. I don't think we were interested in food at that point. It was more like a chore. But there was something cool about being young and being in the kitchen and having it sort of be like chemistry class, where, in chemistry class it was sort of fun and scary, and, there are things that might go wrong. And when they did go wrong, it was actually, it was cool. Like it was more cool when it went wrong than when it went right, almost. And I think that's also a good way to learn to cook, because it's sort of like, it rolls off your back. I have so many friends who are learning to cook now at age, I'm 40.
You're not yet 40.
In August.
Ted loves to age himself, and I love to do the opposite, whatever that's called.
And that's still in high school.
So, what you're trying to say, I think, is that it's important when the stakes are low, when the only person to suffer is the rest of your family, to burn that first pot of rice and to stick yourself at the head of the shrimp and sort of realize the tolerances in the kitchen and to be entrusted with a sharp blade and an open flame. And, you know, that's a precursor to getting your driver's license, I guess. But, you know, once you do acquire that, and really another element in it is that our parents almost insisted on a family meal. You know, every night there was going to be a protein, a starch, and a vegetable, and that sort of three-pointed diversity of color on the plate sort of burns itself into your brain, and suddenly, without even knowing it, you eat healthily, and you have that, you know, diversity of diet, and everyone's together at the table, and so, you know, you're moderated. There's not this anarchy, which we've seen in friends and even some relatives, where everyone's a free agent at the table, and so they sit down whenever they feel like it and eat whatever they want to eat, and there's no sense of commonality. Of course, in Charleston, where until recently the tradition was, you know, a large midday meal, you know, that kind of anarchy is just crazy.
So, what was interesting was that we both went to colleges in the Northeast, and we'd become so accustomed to being here and knowing the foods of this place that we were kind of shocked to find that there really was no good food in Massachusetts. We both went to college in Massachusetts. And especially we missed, you know, things that we've become accustomed to and really love, like boiled peanuts or grits. And just the, you know, the fish and shrimp and oysters and the crabs that we just eat and we think everyone eats like this, but actually no, it's very special. And I think our parents would send us like care packages of boiled peanuts and things like that. The idea for starting a business for people like us who were craving Southern foods but not in the South, didn't happen to be in the South at that very moment, came when we were actually after we graduated from college and we were both living in New York and trying to get jobs that would sort of use the expensive degrees that we got in a way that was logical. And Matt studied art history, so he was interviewing with Christie's and Sotheby's and not getting anywhere. And I had
They
a
could
job.
smell the boiled peanuts on my breath.
And I had a job, but it wasn't really, I thought I wanted to be a writer, and so I thought working for a publisher, I wanted to be a fiction writer, so I worked for an editor who edited fiction. And I realized that if you want to be a fiction writer, actually the worst job you could ever take was working for an editor who was editing fiction. Because
Can I tell this part of the story?
Yeah.
How do you want me to trim it?
Fast.
Okay. So we were getting nowhere in New York, and soaking in the bathtub, I thought, why do they not have boiled peanuts here? And they have everything in New York, as you know. They have fufu flour from Nigeria. They have every esoteric ingredient you could ever want in New York City, but not boiled peanuts. And now this was 1994, and it just seemed absurd and a great opportunity, you know, to fill this gap. And the first challenge, though, was finding raw peanuts, because they don't have raw peanuts in New York. They did, but they were hard to get to because they were in the Hunts Point Terminal Market in the Bronx, which is like the Ellis Island of fruits and vegetables. It all goes through this very hardened, dark, you know, envision a black and white movie, like it's all gray, rendered gray, and there's a slick of gray slurry on the ground that's like this thick, and it's actually open to the public. I mean, it has razor wire across the top, and they do everything to discourage people from coming, but it only costs $2 to shop there. And once you do get in there, and if you are willing to tolerate the gray slurry and the skid steers backing up and trying to run over you, you can purchase a beautiful flat of the most, pristine raspberries imported from Chile, just landed at JFK, for $15, 16 pints for $16, that kind of thing, or a big sack of coconuts for $15. If you wanted to throw a party and wanted to do pina coladas out of a coconut shell, you'd want to go there, if you dared. We dared, and we got a 25-pound box of raw peanuts from North Carolina, and we brought them back to our little tenement apartment on Ludlow Street, coincidentally the old Fruits and Nuts district in Manhattan. We boiled them up, and this was in the middle of a February snowstorm, and the smell that, as Liz Young once described it, because our grandmother lived behind Liz Young's house on Meeting Street, and we used our grandmother's house a lot for boiling peanuts. And once Liz Young came out and said, "That smells like a rotting sweet potato. What is that?" And there is this sort of earthy vegetable quality to the smell of boiled peanuts, but it brought back the sense of being in the Low Country in the summer. And we were in New York City in a wintry snowstorm, and just that trick was so cool of cheating geography and time and all that. But initially we thought our path to fame and fortune was going to be just to introduce boiled peanuts to the bars and restaurants, and they would take off by magic, just wildfire. This was going to be a hit bar snack, and so we printed up business cards that read, Lee Brothers Boiled Peanuts, the snack of the 90s. And hit the streets, visiting bars and restaurants. We, would try to, put them in on consignment. Just try them. See how your bar customers enjoy them. No, it was an instant failure. They wouldn't even let us in the door. Not a single place took them. Well, that's not correct. There was one place that took them on consignment, and it was a restaurant owned by a gentleman from Orangeburg, South Carolina. Alexander Smalls, who is an opera singer who sang in a Spoleto production, and anyhow, he had a sense of humor about us and our project. He let us in the door. But we realized from that experience of total failure that if it was going to work, we'd have to do it by mail order and just aim it toward Southern expatriates like ourselves who didn't need to be educated in boiled peanuts. And so we floated a letter to the New York Times, to Florence Fabricant, who still writes the little food bits and bites, and she called us back and she said, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is the bad news was first. The bad news was she hated them. The good news was she had a friend who had explained them to her, and so she understood that they were correct, and this is the way they were supposed to be. And she wrote up on June 1st, 1994, just a little one paragraph, boiled peanuts now available by mail order, and published our telephone number in the tenement apartment. And the phone started ringing at 5 in the morning, and every time we put it back down, it rang again. And by the end of the day, we had about 150 people who had called us willing to pay $4.50 a pound for boiled peanuts. At the time, boiled peanuts were retailing for about $1 a pound here. But we had absorbed the lessons of New York pricing, and we were off and running. But what's so exciting is that, and this is one of many instances in our biography where we were led to some point that we didn't anticipate, because we did not anticipate writing cookbooks or any of this, or opening for Paula Deen tomorrow. The customers led us to the next step because they immediately started asking for other foods that didn't travel outside the South, like Duke's mayonnaise, Cheerwine soda, in a classier vein, Jerusalem artichoke relish. Some even name-checked Mrs. Sassard. Whole fig preserves, not the pureed type. Stone ground grits and cornmeal. What else? Sorghum molasses. Some things that aren't really native to Charleston South, but anyhow, this whole category opened up to us of, oh gosh, I didn't realize that. I didn't have the perspective to recognize that the things you encounter in the Piggly Wiggly can actually be super exotic and super rare and here and not there. And so we, curated this catalog we decided that very summer, let's create a catalog of Southern foods by mail order. Let's call it the Lee Brothers Boiled Peanuts Catalog. And in that same way that, Cromer's Peanuts in Columbia says the worst boiled peanuts in town, we would style it in such a way that it sort of turned off people who didn't already know. It's sort of a self-selecting club of people who do know. And what that permitted was for us not to put photographs in the catalog. We could run it, just sort of typeset it. It's more like a printed catalog. Run it through our laser printer, fold it in quarters, stitch it up on my old sewing machine, and just put a stamp on it and mail it out. Well, so this catalog was very unusual and attracted the attention of a lot of editors in New York City at the magazines.
I should interrupt to say, by this time, as soon as the idea for the catalog came about, we moved back to Charleston and established our office in the Confederate home where it remains today. And we just kept on doing what we did and sort of learning how to pack a box and sort of those problems of shipping and fulfillment and customer service that we had no idea how to deal with before, but it was an easy sort of learning curve, and it did manage to get the attention of Sever magazine. I think was the first to write about it. They said it was 100 things they love most about food, and so we got this very core niche customer base, but 4 or 5 years on from that, we got another lucky break, which was that one of our customers was the editor-in-chief of Travel and Leisure magazine, and she called and said, "Oh, I love your writing in the catalog," which was sort of a surprise because there's not much writing in the catalog. I think that the description for the okra pickle is, "Who said slimy?" 2 jars, $16.95. But I guess she got the spirit of it, and she said, "I want you to write a story, get on the road, show us a part of South Carolina we don't know." Because, the magazine covers the coast, and that's basically it.
So Charleston was reduced to just a sidebar in this particular story. We just recently, in fact, in the May issue, published the first feature we've ever written about Charleston for Travel and Leisure, but it took 12 years
but
to
it was
get there.
Cool because growing up, we didn't spend a whole lot of time in the upstate, growing up downtown. We'd go to track meets, we'd go to debate. I was on the debate team, so we'd have barbecue on weekends up there, but we didn't, there was a whole upstate left to discover, and I think that was an early lesson in that, when we talk about Southern food, it's one of the things that Matt and I, in interpreting Southern food for other people, it's one of the first lessons, is that when you say Southern food, you have to be more specific. Because how they eat in upstate is different than how we eat here. For example, liver pudding. You won't find a liver pudding in the upstate that's made with rice. It's made with cornmeal, and it's usually called liver mush. Differences like that, and sort of becoming attuned to how differently people eat from place to place. Encountering your first shrimp burger in Beaufort. I made it to 24, 25 before I ever had a shrimp burger. And I do think that's, it's because it's you only find shrimp burgers in real shrimping towns where there's a lot of people with a lot of shrimp, cooking a lot of meals with shrimp, and needing to make it really, really different every single night.
You've never had a shrimp hot dog, though, yet?
No, not yet, but I'm dying to make one. I just need to find out what to use as a casing.
That's easy.
But as soon as that story came out, Food and Wine called and said, "Look, you guys, we love that story. We want you to do the same thing you did for Travel and Leisure, just pick another part of the South." And so that's what set us off on this writing thing. And what was exciting for us is we chose Northern Florida for that story because we just read Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' Cross Creek Cookery, and it was so different than Charleston, the squirrel and the possum and the
swamp cabbage,
all that kind of stuff. And so it sort of set us in motion on kind of discovering the South, discovering that there were other parts of the South that had just as rich food traditions as Charleston, but so different. And so we ended up going to Eastern Kentucky for Food and Wine, where we were there for like 5 days in September, and all their beans were coming in, the potatoes, the onions. We basically
Tomatoes.
We basically ate vegetarian for 5 days, and we never missed it because it was just all about the vegetables there. And then a lot of that job of like traveling different parts of the South was bringing back recipes or recipe ideas that sort of distilled the experience of the journey that we'd taken. And it was especially fun when we could do recipes involving ingredients that we literally never encountered. Like in northern Florida, we found these chilies called datil peppers that were brought over by Menorcan settlers in the 17th century. And they're still there, and people still make pepper sauce out of them, and they're a lot like a habanero. They are fire. They will blow the top of your head off, and they're so delicious. But they have a very distinct flavor. It's sort of tea-like. It's almost like jasmine tea or bergamot. Something very
Closest to the habanero experience.
And in doing that, we sort of got back into the kitchen and really started testing recipes, developing recipes.
And about that time, we began writing for the New York Times.
Yeah.
We floated a list of story ideas, first to the Post and Courier, because we assumed that they would be more receptive to it than the New York Times. Didn't hear back. So we took the same list and sent it to the New York Times, and they called us back, and they wanted 8 out of 12 stories. And some of the subjects were a reappraisal of lard, the shrimp burgers story,
The grits renaissance. Because at that time, Mike Latto was grinding his own grits in that little alley at Anson, that little sort of service alley. And that seemed cool, and a lot of people in Charleston were doing cool things with grits. So we just made a few calls to Atlanta and Birmingham and found a few others.
So the New York Times was coming back at that time, and this is 2000, 2001, to an appreciation of Southern subjects. They didn't have anyone pitching them these stories. Of course, Craig Claiborne was a Southerner, but that was back in the 70s, and whole generations of editors had come through since then. And it was time again to get back to the South. And we were happy to oblige. But writing for them and writing for a newspaper is an entirely different thing than writing for a magazine. Even less money at work there. And so we're often called upon to, we were called upon in every sense to develop the recipes to accompany the story. So if we do a story about grits and we interview chefs from around the country, we have to pull like 2 or 3 recipes from those chefs and redevelop them in the test kitchen. It really got us engaging the material in a more professional way. Sometimes they even asked us to photograph the stories. But
after a while, the New York Public Library asked us to be on a panel about American food or comfort food. I can't really remember what it was, but it was something. We were the Southern representatives there, which was us and Norma Jean Darden, who's this great restaurateur in New York, who grew up in Alabama, I think, and was a fashion model and all this kind of stuff. And she has restaurants now. But in the audience there at that panel was our first book editor, a woman named Maria Guarnaschelli, who's kind of this like really well-known diva of a cookbook editor who's been in it for 40 years and sort of introduced a lot of personalities into cookbook writing, and usually alienated them by the second book. But she was a wonderful.
She's a contemporary of Judith Jones, the famous cookbook editor, and they're not quite contemporaries. But Maria is actively rude. Judith Jones is, very well mannered and everything. Maria will grab you by the shoulder and say, "Ted, you look terrible today. What's going on?" And she means it in the kindest way.
But she was really wonderful for us because we were her first Southern book.
She'd never traveled in the South.
She'd never traveled in the South. We sort of sensed she was a little afraid of the South. But it meant she was asking all the right questions because we wanted our first book to connect not only with Southerners, but also with, Southerners, non-Southerners or would-be Southerners like us, like wannabe Southerners like us. And she asked all the right questions, but it was a funny sort of there were a lot of moments of interpretation that were kind of crazy. Like she's the kind of editor who would take your first draft, go out to her country house, invite 12 people over, and cook a whole menu from the pages you've given her. So she did the first recipes she cooked from the Lee Brothers Southern Cookbook were red velvet cake and fried chicken for 12. And fried chicken went over really well. She called us at 3 a.m. to tell us that. The fried chicken was fabulous, but she was like, what is this red velvet cake? 2 bottles of food coloring? We don't cook like this anymore. And what is this? I mean, did you come up with this recipe? She'd never heard of red velvet cake. And so there was a lot of work like that in sort of translating things and saying, you know, talking her off the ledge. Right before the book, when the book went to press, I mean, it was literally, it had already arrived in Japan. It's somewhere in Asia where it's printed. And she said, I'm going to stop the press because I think I just looked at the index and there's like 64 entries under bacon fat. And I just think wherever we have bacon fat, let's just write and olive oil or olive oil, or you can use olive oil, like some sort of disclaimer. And you're like, Maria, you know what? We're really going to pick our battles here. No, we're never doing this. Do not call this book back. And so, we sort of had to do some convincing, but ultimately she let us write the book we wanted to write, and we're thrilled we did.
Oh, and the coda to the red velvet cake story is that during the photo shoot for the cookbook, we selected about 36 recipes out of 225 to shoot. You'll see it's a more literary cookbook. It doesn't have, recipe photo. But the red velvet cake was one of the ones we shot, and it looked brilliant. And during the shoot, it came off the set with a nice wedge cut in it, and she started picking at it. She was like, guys, there's something wrong. I want you to go back to the drawing board. I want you to work on this recipe, and I want you to fix it. I can't describe it, but there's something just not quite right. So she kept eating it. By the end of the photo shoot, she'd eaten the whole cake.
It was a 4-layer cake, which she had.
And I'm not exaggerating. My mom exaggerates, as you know, but I am not exaggerating in this particular case. So there's a coda to that coda, which is that when was the red velvet cake moment in New York?
I think it was like 2006 or 2007. There was a red velvet cake explosion.
Every little cutesy bakery had a red velvet cupcake and that sort of thing.
It was like on the cover of the dining section, top of the fold, a huge piece, gorgeous red velvet cake.
Maria thinks that she created that craze by publishing this recipe in our cookbook.
What she said was, I remember watching her look through that. She's like, yeah, you can thank me because I told you to put that in the book. And I knew it should stay there.
That's a nice segue to the Southern food explosion in New York right now.
Yeah. I mean,
Ted has a great theory.
There is this great Southern food explosion, and maybe we should have started with it to get deeper into it, because it's sort of you feel sort of conflicted being, I consider myself a Southerner because I grew up here. When you hear that Southern food trends have taken over in New York, you kind of feel like, oh no, this could go badly, right? But actually, it's been really interesting to watch. 2005 was the year that Anson Mills grits hit New York. I mean, grits in general, but specifically stone ground, restaurateurs, chefs getting all geeked up about how, the fineness of the grind, how fresh were yours? I got mine at Dean and DeLuca, and they're wrapped in plastic and in the refrigerator, and they're dated. I got, they're a week off the mill. Because New Yorkers tend to get obsessed with everything that they do, so they start getting almost more obsessed than we do. So that was 2005. 2006 was the year of red velvet cake. 2007 was the year of fried chicken. 2008 was the year of pimento cheese. 2009 was, what was 2009?
Was that boiled?
No, 2010 was boiled peanuts. I mean, that's the real coda to this story. I've lost it, but basically New Yorkers
Country
taken
Ham
on.
was in there.
Oh, Country Ham, yeah. That's 2009 was Country Ham. But classic New York fashion, you know, you can't really get just Country Ham or a Country Ham biscuit. What you get is a Country Ham tasting plate, which you know, where they'll have Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina all on the same plate, maybe with a few pickles, things like that. And isn't that uniquely New York? Because that would never happen here. Because here we would say like, oh, you know, I bring in this one from North Carolina. I know the person who does it. It's the best one. I'm not serving any other ham than this one. Whereas like in New York, it's like, look at the wealth of hams that we can get. You know, look at this. This is amazing. And we can charge $22 for the plate.
Sea Captain's Curio Cabinet.
But there, you know, there is, I brought here a sort of description of a dish that I was just tickled. I was reading the review of a new restaurant just opened called Imperial Number 9. It's in the Mondrian Hotel in Soho, and it just opened. The chef, Sam Talbot, who was like, you know, the third runner-up on the season of Top Chef, third season of Top Chef.
Can we just preface by saying there's been a wave of Southern flavored restaurants opening in New York in just the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, we've been pitching this story to the current editor at the New York Times dining section, to no avail. He's been totally not blind to it because he loves Southern food, but he's been trying to suppress this story for some reason we haven't figured out. But this is the latest of like a long line of Southern restaurants. We could probably name 15 off the top of our head.
So they have a shrimp and grits on the menu, which the New York Magazine critic described as delicious. First of all, it's heirloom blue corn grits. All right. You know what that looks like, right? Blueberry yogurt. Right. Heirloom blue corn grits with manchego
Cheese.
mixed into it. All right.
Spanish cheese.
And then
Sheep's milk cheese.
it doesn't end there. And then there's maple syrup.
Yow.
And coffee oil. So it's sort of like a northern breakfast and a southern thing. But here's the interesting thing, like, this is a chef who grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Like, he knows from good shrimp and grits, you know, I mean, it's not like...
He might not. Charlotte's way inland. It's beyond the shrimp belt, that's for sure.
But that is the kind of instance where you want to say like, oh no, this is scary. But we feel like there's no reason to fear Southern food taking over the world, because at the same time in the last 15 years, the more excited people get, the deeper people tend to explore. And we've seen the rise of, you know, just Southern foodways as a discipline, as an academic discipline. And for us, it's completely changed in many ways the way we sort of perceive Southern food. And it's exposed us to new voices. There's an organization that we're members of called the Southern Foodways Alliance that was started about 12 years ago in Oxford, Mississippi, and it's a quasi-academic group that really, its mission is to document the food culture of the American South. And it means, you know, oral histories. They send interns out into all over the South, you know, talking with farmers, home cooks, restaurateurs, and really like creating a massive sort of documentary, what am I trying to say? A record.
A body of work.
A record, a body of work. And they recently shined their light on, they do documentaries as well on South Carolina, and did a documentary about Scott's Barbecue in Hemingway, South Carolina. It's an amazing place that does, you know, old school from, they harvest the wood themselves and they pull it themselves. They're doing it from, you know, from stem to stern, they're doing it real. And it's a great documentary. They did one on Emile Felice, the guy who's doing pasture-raised pork, you know, organic pork.
And he ran for governor.
And he didn't run for governor, he ran for agricultural commissioner.
All right, sorry about that.
But
He's gonna run for governor.
But so they're documenting old ways, new ways, because Emile represents sort of a new way, and they also did a documentary about the squirrel gravy tradition in an African American family in Mount Pleasant, and it's just a Thanksgiving tradition. They go out there, they shoot squirrels out of the trees, they cook them, and they make this incredible gravy, and they've done it for 30 years. And the whole family comes around, And it's just like, you know, from family to restaurant to farm, it's being covered. So, and I'm not even the academics who are sort of changing the way we view Southern food and food history. We think there's a tendency to be nostalgic for the food you grew up with, and that's cool. Like, we get it. We're nostalgic for the 80s in Charleston, but you know, what we're finding out about what farmers grew in the 18th and 19th centuries is kind of blowing our minds, because we're kind of digging into it deep. Our next book is about Charleston and the Low Country, and we had no idea there was a sesame oil press in Charleston in 1735. Did y'all know that? Like, that was the salad oil of this town, sesame oil.
And
That's
asparagus
crazy.
was a major crop here in the 1920s. Major. And cabbage around the same time out on Young's Island. Citrus. We've been interviewing a lot of people around town in service of this new book, which will come out in 2013. And we've been in a lot of places around town. And we were interviewing Side-Eye Limehouse. And we interrupted him. He was plowing a field on his tractor. And so he was like, come aboard. And so Ted was on one running board and I was on the other running board, and we were trying to take notes at the same time. Transcribing these notes is just murder, but he explained to us that we asked him, why is citrus not a crop here? You know, in people's backyards, there's tons of lemons and grapefruits and kumquats and all sorts of interesting citrus, but there's no orchards. There's no fig orchards. Why is that? Well, he explained that back in the early part of the century, there were citrus orchards, and they were very popular, and it's just that the market evaporated because they were competing with California at a certain point once refrigerated trucking came in. Yeah, to view Charleston food or the food of any place just by what you experienced in 1945, 1955 is to lose sight of the fact that the fruits and vegetables, the meats, everything is a constantly evolving landscape. And in many ways, the foods of Charleston in the 19th century and even the 18th century were even more diverse than they are today. We're definitely entering a wonderful time where the farmers markets are reviving. The prospect of a head of broccoli or collards being sold at the market is coming closer again. When we first moved here, there were some vegetables being sold at one end of the market, and I don't think there's anything organic being sold there now, but it's coming. There's some change of it, and people's interest in preserving, in the health of their food, and the distance it travels is greater, and so you begin to see the agricultural areas on Johns Island and Wadmalaw especially beginning to come back into productive use. It's been interesting to watch as fields out there have gone, you know, to weeds and pine trees, and then have now been cleared again to be recultivated.
But it really is only in the last 5 years or so that we've sort of come to see that there's a value to seeing Southern cooking as a living art. We're never going to lose the traditions that we have and we know from whenever it was that we grew up, because they're so deeply rooted. I mean, it's like we're never not going to be doing oyster roasts in our backyards. We don't have to worry about if some Yankee wants to do an oyster roast with like a gas grill and whatever, you know. We don't have to worry about losing our culture if we also embrace, you know, the new Southern food culture, which is also sort of, you know, confounding us in some ways. You know, you have Sean Brock, a chef from Virginia, doing crazy things with heirloom ingredients. You know, he's reaching back to find heirloom beans, rice, sesame seed, like varieties we haven't seen for 200 years, and yet he's putting them in these like machines that the top chef molecular gastronomists use that are so futuristic. And it kind of makes your head explode. And does it taste good? Well, that's the ultimate test. But it's fun that in the process we get to see both where we've been and also where we might be going. And I think we have to wrap it up because we've already spoken over time. We want to take any questions you may have. Yes, Ms. Lassane.
This lady here, when we were talking about the complex that Rome was, and I
Because
I have poured boiling water over my low
Loquats,
pots.
yes. And started peeling them? Yeah.
And low pot preserves are fabulous.
What?
the question was, loquats preserves are fabulous and ripe right now. Why aren't y'all putting up loquats right now? Well, the answer is,
How many people make loquat preserves? 1, 2, 3.
how many people make loquat liqueur?
1, 2. There's less liqueur than there is preserves. That doesn't make sense. This is Charleston.
What's been fun about researching deep on Charleston is that there are so many things that we take for granted here that we don't really even notice until we dwell on it too much. And one of the things is like, why don't we appreciate loquats enough? Because they're really a thing here. I mean, every block has a tree. They're super ripe. Now is the time. I mean, someone should have written a poem about loquats in Charleston right now.
I do have a question though.
Yet they don't appear in many of the cookbooks. There aren't any loquats in Charleston receipts. No. Another question along these lines is that we've been trying to ask is, why is beef associated with okra? If you make an okra stew in this town or a soup, it's not seasoned with pork, it's seasoned with beef. And we've been going around and asking different people. I was in the kitchen at Mrs. Hamby's just the other day, and I asked one of the cooks there, who's famous for her collards or whatever, so what seasoning meat do you use? Well, she uses ham hock. Well, how about if you make an okra stew, why do you not use pork? She said, how do you know? Use beef. Anyhow, we've been asking these questions around town, and so our next book is going to come up with a map of why Charleston is even more special than you think it is from a food standpoint.
Well,
Pulled pork is an upstate thing. We've asked various people, including someone in this audience, what kind of pork did you grow up with? And the answer was not much here in Charleston. Maybe a fresh ham at Easter, but country ham, country cured ham, the dry smokehouse ham that you have to resuscitate from its mummification. That was not a very common thing here.
I should say one thing as a coda. I said 2010 was the year of the boiled peanut, and I discovered that because we were doing a story for Garden Gun about the wave of every cool restaurant that opens in New York right now has to have boiled peanuts. And there's one of them in particular that is hyper hot right now. The Breslin. It's April Bloomfield's restaurant, and she tasted the boiled peanuts. She's a Brit. She's British. And she had tasted them and she said, yeah, these are good, but they need more flavor. And so not only are they boiled, they're boiled and then they're fried in pork fat. And then they're salted, and then you get a little ramekin of them like this for $6. Question, Catherine.
I was just wondering if you could talk about your perspective on some of the causes of the Southern food renaissance.
Yeah.
The question is, do we know the cause of the Southern food renaissance? And Ted knows the answer.
I know the answer. I think it's part of a general interest that's taking hold nationwide in food. And, you can say, oh, well, it's the Food Network. The Food Network might be influential, the magazines might be influential, but ultimately, it's an interest in the ingredients.
And where in this country
Where
do you
else?
have the same richness, that critical mass of unique, interesting ingredients with great stories behind them? I mean, the South.
It's the South.
Could you do a cookbook like Charleston Receipts in Minnesota? No. Could you do it in Western Massachusetts? No. You could have a good time. You could do a great magazine story about the native foods of those places, but you couldn't break it out to this level. I mean, the number of Southern cookbooks. Do you want to talk a little bit about Southern cookbooks? Ted did some research earlier today about the
It's just interesting.
popularity of Southern cookbooks, which I guess is the canary in the coal mine for the
Yeah.
general interest in Southern cooking.
Well, I just also want to say that I think Southern cooking has been maligned for a long time by people outside the South who,
Don't know what it is.
It's been misrepresented. And so as soon as someone does go deeper, just like scratch the surface, like maybe they were introduced to it on a TV show, and then like if they taste sorghum and they get into that, and then they go on and go to the grits, it's so rewarding. And you do find out, like, if you're a food snob in New York or the Bay Area, you've traveled in Italy and you know that you can taste how things change from region to region. Like, you can taste the difference when you travel and you perceive yourself as sophisticated. Well, when you travel around the South, it's the same way. So in a way, it's the most rewarding place for like a snobby foodie to travel. So the Southern Cookbooks thing, this is interesting. The James Beard Awards are the sort of Oscars of the food world, and they go to chefs, they go to cookbook writers and journalists. Garden and Gun magazine just won the James Beard Award for journalism. But that's a side note. I was studying, since 1999, I studied in the American category of cookbooks, who were the nominees and who got the awards.
There's 3 nominees every year.
There's 3 nominees and 1 winner. And I think from 1999 to 2006, I think there were 3 total nominees in the American category that were Southern books. 3 nominees and no wins. Yeah, that was one of them. That was one of them. And in 2007, we were nominated and we won. We won in the American category, and we won Cookbook of the Year. Since then, every winner since then has been a Southern cookbook. 2008 was Gene Anderson. 2009 was Martha Hall Foose. 2010 was Donald Link. 2011 was Pig, King of the Southern Table by James Villas. And it's interesting, but also 2010, every single book, our second book was nominated in 2010, and Donald Link's was, and John Betch. So it was like, I mean, the South had it wrapped up. We had the win regardless. And, you know, people say, well, what do you think of the, is it a trend? Is it here to stay, or is it going to go? And I think it's just that, it's an awakening. What's exciting for us is that it establishes this sort of body of knowledge that we can move forward from, and really get people to understand just how rich and diverse the food culture of the American South is, and to get people excited about exploring it even further. Because, when we said our next book was going to be a Charleston book, I can't tell you how many people said, oh, all those stories have been told, I don't know why please. And all it takes is just to spend a day on a real crabber or shrimper's boat, and you'll have a novel's worth of stories to tell. Most of them will be true, but it really is like there's no end to the amount of story and culture that the foodways of the South provide, I think. Does that answer your question? Anything else? Yes, sir.
Do you have a favorite Southern restaurant in New York?
Do we have a favorite Southern restaurant in New York?
I do.
Go for it.
It's called Egg. It's in Brooklyn, and not coincidentally probably, it's owned by a guy who grew up in Charleston and went to Porter Gavitt and graduated in 1990. It's a great restaurant. It's, I would say he's really influenced by the Hominy Grill.
George Weld.
George Weld is the guy who owns it. And he sort of started the restaurant like we started the Boiled Peanuts catalog. He'd never owned a restaurant in his life. He had no idea what he was getting into. But it's really great. You can get a country ham biscuit. It's sort of like the Hominy Grill, but it's a little bit more spare. It's much more basic than the Hominy Grill, but it's just, the spirit of it is so Southern. And it's charming and wonderful. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I always wondered why lamb wasn't originally popular here. It is now, just the way also by anything. But when I came in here just 7 years earlier than your mother, I was eating lamb chops and leg of lamb, and it just wasn't, you couldn't get a leg of lamb without a special request.
I know the reason. The reason is that sheep don't do well in hot, humid climates, so they just weren't traditionally raised here. Someone might have a a yard animal or two, but to grow them en masse for the meat market just would not work here because of they get some fungus or something like that. I mean, a more interesting question is why we don't have as much pork, because pigs do very well in the swamps and marshes and things like that, and fending for themselves. But on that inauspicious note, fending for yourselves in the marshes, I guess that's a metaphor for what we do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
My wedding in England, I wanted to serve lamb, and my German husband Felix said if we did, his grandmother would probably leave the room. And it was because after the Second World War, old sheep were sort of the thing they had to eat because they didn't have much else. So lamb does not go well in Germany at all. Thank you both so much. We really hope that you stay a very long time researching the rest of your next book, and that you're here as much as possible. And the Lee brothers have really kindly donated a portion of the proceeds of their books today to the Library Society, so please buy one of their books, and maybe they'll even sign it for you. And thank you all very much for coming. Next week is Alexandra Mack, the editor of Vogue.com, so please buy your tickets quickly, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you. Thanks again.